Hello. So in this video, we're going to be talking about William Shakespeare's Richard III. I'm joined by uh, my good friend Jeff Yeager to talk about this play. Jeff, thanks for being here.
Always glad to be here with you, Phil.
So Dr. Jeff Yeager is an assistant professor of English at Bluefield State University in Bluefield, West Virginia. He earned his BA from Concord University, his MA from Ohio University, and his PhD from West Virginia University. Jeff specializes in late 19th and early 20th century American literature. Jeff is now pursuing a second MA degree in Catholic philosophy. At Bluefield State, Jeff teaches classes on composition, world literature to the Renaissance, English grammar, Steinbeck, philosophy, and ethics. Jeff also performs every summer for the Appalachian Shakespeare Project, including in Richard III, which is a big part of the reason I invited Jeff to talk about this play. Besides his work, Jeff enjoys watching films, playing video games, and spending time with his wife Courtney and cats Franny and Smokey. So, Jeff, can you give us a brief plot summary of what's going on in Shakespeare's play?
Okay, so first off, reading Richard III, of course you can read it in isolation, but it's the fourth play in Shakespeare's first tetralogy of history plays, and the leading play, the plays before it are the three Henry VI plays, where Richard is actually a character, and then this play kind of ends that series of plays. So this play takes place during the War of the Roses, and so it begins with the York family, who has overcome the Plantagenet family for a short time, and so Richard's brother, King Edward, is now the king. So Richard is a schemer. He is a villain. Shakespeare kind of helped create this idea of rooting for the villain in a way. So Richard kind of takes you on this journey with him as he seeks to gain power and become king. And during the course of the play, you see how Richard goes about doing that. He first murders his brother. He arranges for the murder of his brother Clarence, and then several other characters die during the course of the play. Lord Hastings is one who dies, as well as Richard's brother Edward, and Edward's sons, who are just young children, also die during the course of the play by Richard's machinations. And but across the play, Richard marries Anne at the beginning. Anne was the widow of I think she was the widow of Henry VI. I might be wrong. Yeah,
I think so.
And but eventually she stops being useful to him, so he seeks to marry his younger cousin. And that side of the family decides to side with the Tudor family, who his name is Richmond in the play, but Richmond is actually King Henry VII, the first of the Tudor dynasty. And the Tudors, and at the end of the play, there's this great battle scene, and Henry VII overcomes Richard. And at the end of the play sort of celebrates the fact that this tyrant is now dead, and England is now going to go into a golden age.
Yeah. And of course, this play was written, I think, mid-1590s, so during the reign of Elizabeth I, who was actually the last of the Tudor dynasty. So there is a little bit of sort of hey, look how great your ancestors were in overcoming this horrible villain who was the other, sort of the other side. So there definitely is that element. This play has been called Tudor propaganda, and I don't think that's an unfair characterization of it. So can we sort of start by talking a little bit about that? Because there is, especially in the past several years, since Richard's body was actually found. T-shirt with the this is sort of an image of what Richard's body was found, what the position his body was found in when it was excavated. So we actually, between finding his body and a new generation or two of historians who have been less shaped by Shakespeare's portrayal and more interested in looking to medieval sources, there seems to be quite a wide gap between the historical Richard and the literary Richard. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I definitely agree that it's called the Tudor myth in the scholarship. But yeah, the play is obviously demonizing the York family to make the Tudor family look better. And Shakespeare did the same exact thing in his second tetralogy of plays with Henry V. He made Henry V look really good as well. So yeah, the play definitely demonizes Richard for that purpose. I think Shakespeare had actually gotten in trouble at one point after this play when he wrote Richard II, because it shows the act of deposing a king on stage, and he had to be very careful with how he portrayed these things if he wasn't going to be censored.
Yeah,
so,
I think the Richard III one, or the Richard II one, is actually a really interesting one, because if I'm not mistaken, in the late 1590s or around 1600, somewhere in there, the Earl of Essex led a rebellion against Elizabeth I, and he commissioned a special performance, I think, of Richard II, because it showed a monarch being deposed. And so there was some suspicion that maybe Shakespeare was somehow in sympathy with Essex's rebellion, though as far as I know, there's no actual sort of evidence of that. Like, it was just sort of like when a contemporary politician uses music in a campaign without necessarily having the permission of the artist, right?
he was arrested and questioned.
Yeah. But he
up.
was released, and then he had the rest of his playwriting career, which is probably a good thing for all of us. But yeah, I think some of the really distinct differences between Richard's portrayal in this play and what we have from the historical evidence are sort of worth noting. So one is, in this play, Richard reigns for about an act and a half. Like, his reign is really not very long, and nothing particularly happens in it, apart from him scheming to marry some people, killing off, I think it's Buckingham who gets killed off at that point, killing off this guy who had been a supporter of his. And then all these rebellions crop up, led predominantly by Richmond, who again becomes Henry VII later on. But the actual sort of medieval records about Richard's reign show that he was a pretty good administrator, that he actually sort of ran a relatively stable country for the couple of years that he was in office. in office. I don't know if that's the right way to refer to the monarchy or not. But and then one of the biggest, well, two of the biggest elements of Shakespeare's characterization have really been called into question, right? Richard is very much presented by Shakespeare as being significantly deformed, being hunchbacked and having a shriveled arm. And actually, if you look at this is Mark Rylance at the Apollo Theatre in London from a 2012 production. Like this title image that the Norton Critical Editions shows. Like you can see, he very much has sort of underdeveloped hand. The actual skeletal remains of Richard showed that I think, had like scoliosis or something, right? He had like probably a slightly curved back from a spinal deformity or something like this, but it wasn't this really significant physical issues that Shakespeare presents. And then, of course, the other is that there are a lot of questions about whether or not Richard had murdered all of the people that Shakespeare claims he did, especially the Tower Princes, the two sons of Edward, who in this play, it's very clear that Shakespeare has them killed, but there are other contenders for who might have killed them. But I also think there's an element that there's something that you had said earlier that I think is really interesting, that Shakespeare, in a way, wants us to maybe not like, but to at least sort of admire and sympathize with Richard. So Richard is probably one of the most celebrated stage villains. Why? What makes him such a great villain?
Oh, there's several points that you made that I'd like to talk about here. The first relates back to the Tudor propaganda, and that's the idea of a scourge. Like there's this idea that God sometimes sends a scourge to punish the people for their sins, and Shakespeare definitely kind of carries on in that tradition and depicts Richard as this god-awful villain as a way to almost cleanse England of its sins per se. And but the way that to build on your second question, and the way that Richard is depicted in the play, like there's that great, from the very opening lines of the play, Richard gives that excellent soliloquy, and now is the winter of their discontent, made glorious summer by the son of York. And Richard, this is one of Shakespeare's first great soliloquies in his canon. This is when you really started to see him sort of grow into his powers as a writer. And at the very beginning, Richard makes you feel pity for him, right? He talks about how he cannot, since he cannot prove a lover, he must determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days, right?
Yeah.
Like Richard kind of shows you at the beginning almost that shows that he doesn't have free will, right? In a way, he has a biological determinism of sorts that has made him the way that he is, and because of that, he can never achieve happiness in the way that most people can. So he might as well just play his part and be a villain. And from the very moment of that speech, he says, "Follow me," right? Here's what I'm getting ready to do to Clarence, right? So you just kind of follow along with him. The stage Machiavel is what that's called.
Yeah.
This Machiavellian type character who you sort of follow along with during the course of the drama. And this is something that we see a lot of in even modern media. The show House of Cards that followed Kevin Spacey's character, and he would break the fourth wall and directly address the viewer. Richard play pretty much invented this type of character. So his deformities, for sure. You talked about his in the play. He has like the hand. There's the one scene where he shows Lord Hastings his hand and says, he says he condemns Lord Hastings, saying that a curse has been put on him.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such an odd scene to me, right? Because Richard claims that the Queen's family have cursed him, and he has this physical disability because they have cursed him. And Hastings is like, we should look into that. And Richard's like, you doubted my word, therefore you're a traitor. Off with his head. And it is this very odd scene where, like, because right, the first soliloquy, that's such an amazing soliloquy, and we're going to come back to that in more detail. But that gives us Richard the schemer, Richard the calculated villain, the Machiavel, right? The person who has a plan for everything. But in this scene where he says, I have been cursed, and Hastings says, yeah, let's follow up on that. Let's like get some evidence and make sure that that's what happened. And Richard just flies off the handle. It's a little bit hard to tell whether this is purely Richard being calculating and he knew that Hastings would want evidence, or whether this is the sort of first indication that there's another side to Richard where he is impulsive and he does sort of demand that everything he wants be gone along with. Because we get that very much later in the play where he does start making these very bad decisions based on what he wants to be true, especially going into the Battle of Bosworth Field. This idea that, like, all these people are going to remain loyal to me, and the other side's not really going to fight very hard for Richmond, and probably a lot of them will defect to my side. And there's just no reason to think any of this in the play. So I don't know. What do you think? Is he consistently the schemer who is in control of everything, or is he the schemer for whom the mask sometimes slips?
Yeah, I think he's definitely the schemer for whose mask sometimes slips. A lot of the characters in the play, especially Queen Elizabeth, call him on it. Like, you're a foul toad, foul toad. That moment with Hastings, I think, is the beginning of his downfall of sorts. This is even before he becomes king.
Yeah,
but his Buckingham is pretty much his kingmaker in the play. Like, Buckingham helps him get to where he is, and he would not have gotten there without Buckingham. And the way that all Buckingham wants is a dukedom, and
a dukedom that Richard promised him.
Yeah, Richard, for some reason or other, is reticent to give it to him after he becomes king. Maybe he doesn't trust Buckingham himself, but if he would have followed through on that promise, then maybe the war would have turned out differently, just because Buckingham is really the true power of the play.
Yeah.
So that sort of leads to um, the sort of conflict ending the way that it does, as well as the fact that Richard discards Anne and then wants to marry his younger cousin. Um, yeah, he's Richard's even then sort of basking in his villainy, like I killed. There's that great. It's been since last year since we performed it, but there's that great line where he tells Queen Elizabeth, like, I killed the fruit of your loins, right? And now we'll make new fruit. So why are you still sad? Um, you know, I will pay back the debt I gave you from killing old children by giving you grandchildren.
Yeah.
So that moment, I think Richard sort of loses calculating self in that scene, especially, and just sort of just basks in his villainy without sort of thinking through the consequences. And what does she do? She just she's deservingly so runs off to Richmond and marries Richmond. Right? Do you really want to side with the guy who just murdered your family? He doesn't really think. He doesn't really think it through. He shows his true colors often throughout the play, and not Queen Elizabeth notices it. Margaret, from the very beginning, notices that Margaret is one of the great characters in the Henry VI trilogy, and oftentimes different stage versions or film versions. Even though I think she's a key ingredient in the play, because she at the very beginning is telling everyone, if you trust this guy, you're going to pay for it. You're going to be sorry. Yeah. She puts the curse on Richard, and of course, there's that great scene where she curses him, and then the scene with Queen Elizabeth. Margaret comes back, and Elizabeth's like, it's time to finish the curse. We didn't quite finish it before. He wouldn't let me put a point to the end of the curse. So Margaret especially is there. Margaret in the Shakespeare plays herself was not a good person, right? She murdered some of Richard's family in the previous play. But she's there at the beginning to show, hey, you can't trust this guy. This is his true colors. And the fact that no one listens to her just because she's the enemy, they should have, right? Because she was right.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a really important point, and this is one of the things that gets tricky when assessing medieval monarchs, especially in a period like the War of the Roses or the Anarchy early in the Norman period. Like today, if you have a leader of a country, a head of state or something like that, who regularly murders their political opponents, that's a bad thing. We don't like that. That most people disapprove of political murders. But in the medieval period, they were sort of part and parcel of being a monarch, right? So, and again, there's a distinction here between the literary and the historical Richard, because, for instance, we don't know that Richard had the Tower Princes killed. Some people very much believe it. Some people think that it was somebody else, maybe Buckingham, maybe somebody else working on Richard's behalf without Richard's sort of explicit command. Some people think that there was someone else who had the Tower Princes murdered. And some people are like, we actually have no physical evidence that the Tower Princes ever were murdered. They disappear. No one knows where they're buried to this day. whether they were murdered as children, whether they lived out their lives in secret in the tower, sort of Man in the Iron Mask style, whatever it is. But because they had, especially the older one, Edward, there's a lot of Edwards, a lot of Richards, a lot. People have very, very limited naming pool for the aristocracy in the medieval and early modern period. But because young Edward, who in principle should become the next king, he has the strongest and most definite claim to the throne. In order for Richard to get the throne, those kids have to be out of the line of succession. And he does try and convince people, or he has Buckingham convince people that the Tower princes are illegitimate, and then he has them brutally murdered. That's not okay. I'm not saying that's fine, but it was not that unusual in the medieval period. I mean, the Plantagenets, I think, came to the throne by sort of killing off their rivals in a struggle over succession. The Yorks definitely did. The whole premise of the War of the Roses is we think we have a better claim to the throne, and we're willing to kill you to prove it. And of course, the Tudors come to the throne because the future Henry VII kills Richard at Bosworth Field. Like, Henry VII, and this was actually one of the big problems for the Tudors, especially Henry VII, and to a lesser extent Henry VIII, is they weren't the natural inheritors of. If Richard had just died of natural causes or something, Henry Tudor would not have been next in line. The only reason the Tudors come to the throne is because he kills Richard, and everybody's like, great work, now you're king. So there is this sort of weird ethical element to it where Richard is a villain because he kills people to get to the throne. Richmond is a hero because he kills Richard to get to the throne. So I think the ethics of this play are much murkier than Shakespeare might have wanted us to believe. Or maybe that's an oversimplification of what Shakespeare wants us to see in the play.
Yeah, the fact that Richmond marries Richard's younger cousin shows that Richmond comes from the Plantagenet family, right? So
Yeah.
he says this is how I will unite the white rose and the red. So that's
well, and I don't even think he was really the top of the succession list on the Lancasterian side. He was like fifth in line, and he only gets to be king because he marries, I can't think of the younger cousin's name, and kills Richard. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely almost feels abrupt in the play, just because Richmond isn't even introduced until Act 5.
Yeah.
So yeah, like it doesn't really. It plants a seed with like a line early in the play, but yeah, I think that's one of the things that throws people off about the play, just how abrupt that it feels. The fact that he's not an antagonist throughout the whole, or protagonist, if you want to say, throughout the whole play. So it definitely shows that again, it sort of weakens the idea of the monarchy. I mean, it shows that you can get there. It's all about power more so than blood.
Yeah. So, there was a couple of other things that you had mentioned when you were talking about the opening soliloquy, and I want to come back to them because I think they're really important elements of the play. So one is the idea of fate, right? Because this is a play filled with references to fate. Um, in that opening soliloquy, Richard says, "This is my lot in life. This is what I have to do." We have repeated references to dreams. Clarence has a very, like, obviously premonition style dream of being drowned, and then he is killed by being drowned in a butt of wine. Um, I think it's Hastings, maybe, sort of says, "Oh, this other lord, I can't remember who, maybe Rivers, I don't remember, um, had a dream where the boar raised its visor and charged, and the boar was the symbol of Richard, so that's a very obvious one." And Hastings like dismisses it, and then later he's like, "Well, Richard has killed me. I should have listened to that dream." Um, so but then you've also got these sort of discussions of like the wheel of fate, right? Which was the very common medieval and early modern conception where like uh, fortune or luck is this sort of circular system where when stuff is going bad, you're going to get sort of lifted up by the wheel of fortune and things will start to get better for you, but then things will get good and now you're going to go down again. And so there was this idea of like rotating fate, good luck, bad luck type thing. And we see that throughout this play as well, these sort of references to the Wheel of Fortune. Because throughout most of it, of course, Richard's status is going up, and then in really the end of Act 4, where we start to head toward the Battle of Bosworth Field, it very abruptly goes down. And most other people's luck is sort of moving the opposite direction throughout. So what do you make of the sort of role of fate, the role of prophecy, the role of dreams, all this stuff in the play? And why is it so central?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I think Richard being a scourge is part of this play's design. He's
Yeah,
for a purpose. That purpose is to punish England. And so in this way, you can kind of read it as this is almost God-given fate, right?
yeah,
That Richard comes to power and then meets a bloody end the way that he does. Margaret's scene where she puts the curse on Richard, that's meant to show that Margaret actually does have mystical powers, able enough to put that curse on him.
yeah,
And then, of course, the dream at the end. The dream that Richard has right before Bosworth Field, where he sees all these ghosts of his past coming back to haunt him. I think everybody he kills throughout the play shows up at the end.
yep,
Clarence shows up. The princes show up. Hastings, Buckingham, King Edward, King
yep,
Henry VI. All of Richard's victims show up at the end of the play and say, "Die!" Right?
yeah,
And so you almost see like this spiritual warfare of sorts that's happening, where all these forces, even in the spiritual realm, are turning against Richard. So how could Richard overcome all of that? Right?
yeah,
That scene almost shows you that Richard's destined to die. So
yeah,
yeah, this is interesting because this is the time period in England where Calvinism was especially developing. Like the radical Calvinists didn't like the play, didn't like the theater, right? They wanted to shut the theater down.
Hmm.
You're starting to see this theology of predestination and things like that originating in the time. Shakespeare plays with this even throughout more of his plays. Macbeth, he certainly does.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, and that's really interesting because I think that's a really important context is the religious struggles going on at the time. Because you've got, I mean, Henry VIII, obviously, Elizabeth the First's father, breaks away from the church in Rome, founds the Anglican Church. Um, his son Edward kind of doesn't matter that much because his reign is short and he didn't really do anything. So then Mary Tudor tries to reinstall Catholicism, and then Elizabeth I comes along, and bang, we're back in Anglicanism. And Catholics are persecuted, but also dissenters are persecuted, which includes a sort of broad range of Calvinists, Puritans, Quakers, basically anybody who said, I'm not 100% on board with the Church of England. But both the Church of England and the Catholic Church, which, I mean, in the era of Richard III, the Catholic Church was the only game in town, obviously. Both the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church, for as much as they differ about some things, they are sort of high church.
Liturgical.
Yeah. And so I think for a lot of high church institutions, there is a bit more of an ambivalence about the idea of fate, right? The Calvinists very much come along and they say God has set everything in motion. There is nothing you can do about it. If you're elected for salvation, you're elected for salvation. None of your earthly deeds make any difference. But for Catholicism and to a lesser extent, for Anglicanism, good works matter. Participating in the sacraments matters. So the things that you do in life, your faith, your devotion does actually matter. And so there is that tension between the idea of the divine plan and the idea of free will, right? Because if what I do in life matters, then it's harder to square that necessarily with the idea that there's a divine plan and everything is set. And of course, I mean, as someone pursuing a degree in Catholic philosophy, these are centuries old debates. But I think there is that sort of element of like, you're in this weird religious period where there's major conflicts, and people are, it's not the sort of comfort of the medieval period where the Catholic Church told you what the theology was and that was the theology. You have different people coming up with radically competing theological ideas, and individuals or communities are having to sort of figure out, what do we think is true? What do we think is God's take on everything? So yeah, I think that's really important.
Yeah, the Calvinists, as you said, were very much anti-high church. They wanted
Yeah.
the word Puritan comes from the idea of purification. Right? They wanted to purify the Anglican Church of all
Yeah.
the Catholic remnants. So all the pomp and ceremony of the Catholic Mass, they wanted to expunge and
Yeah.
simplify worship to its bare simplicity. So no images in the church. This idea still holds up today. Like a lot of Protestants will say, Catholics worship statues and
Yeah.
things like that. But that comes from this idea of Calvinism. Like, we want to purify everything, and yeah, this is an idea that Shakespeare plays with throughout a lot of his plays. I mentioned Macbeth, Julius Caesar is another.
Yeah.
Often, how Shakespeare feels about the Calvinists is an interesting question, because this play definitely feels very Calvinist. But
Yeah.
in other plays, he ridicules them. Malvolio in Twelfth Night
Yeah. That's the one I was thinking of.
he's a Calvinist, and he is ridiculed throughout the play. Um,
But there's also some suspicion that Shakespeare, or at the very least Shakespeare's father, might have been a closet Catholic. So, I mean, my personal view of Shakespeare, if you're asking my opinion, is that he was probably pretty middle of the road. Like, I think he, for as much as we have these plays where monarchy gets overthrown, monarchs get killed, etc., we always pretty much end up settling back on a better monarch at the end. Like, I think in many ways he's very, if not conservative, then he's at least very cautious. And so I think he's probably much more sort of standard, boring Church of England than he is a dissenter as such.
yeah.
But there's a lot of debate about that. And there are people who think that he was very sympathetic to Catholicism. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
he mentions the sacraments in the play.
Yeah.
Uh, the scene with Clarence when the murderers are murdering Clarence is who I played, by the way.
Yeah.
But the scene with the murderers, the murder, Clarence says about, like, swears on the sacraments and thing. And so Shakespeare was very well read, but
Yeah.
he had to be careful with how he depicted religion. It says, this video is for your students, but oftentimes they couldn't make direct mention of God in the play. If they did, they had to call him Jove, like
Yeah.
referencing Greek and Roman myth. Yeah, because
Well,
if
and
they mention God, they could be persecuted, right? They could be shut down.
yeah. Well, and actually, after um, Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, like, that was such a religiously controversial play that the official censor of the time was called the Master of the Revels, and that, like, before a play could be put on, the company who actually owned the plays, like Shakespeare didn't own the works of Shakespeare, the what was it, the Admiral's Men, and then later the King's Men, I think, were his theater companies. They owned the plays. So the company would have to send the script of Richard III, for instance, to the Master of the Revels. He would read it and he would be like, all right, yeah, this is fine, or no, you can't perform this, whatever it was. And after Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, a new rule was instituted that you could not have plays about religious topics. And so, yeah, that religious elements really get skimmed out of early modern drama after that. You do still have instances like in John Webster's Duchess of Malfi, for instance, where you have a cardinal who is doing all this villainous stuff, like murdering people and torturing his sister and having sex despite the vow of celibacy and all these things. But you could do that if you sort of shifted it to Italy or Spain or somewhere in southern England in southern Europe, where you had a predominantly Catholic population. You could villainize Catholics for doing all sorts of heinous things, but when it was a history play or when it was set in England, especially, off the table. You're not doing religious critique in an English history play. Yeah. So there's one more major thing that I want us to talk about. It from a modern perspective, it's one of, I think, the most important elements of Richard III, and that's Richard and disability. So I'm gonna pull up the opening soliloquy here. I want to read this opening soliloquy because it really does set the tone for the sort of the important relationship between Richard's physical body and his ethical character. So this is Act 1, Scene 1. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this sun of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monument, our stern alarms changed to merry meetings, our dreadful marches to delightful measures, grim-visaged war hath smoothed his wrinkled front, and now instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, and this is where it starts getting into Richard's self-presentation, but I that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking-glass, I that am rudely stamped and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph, I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. Why, I in this weak piping time of peace have no delight to pass away the time, unless to spy my shadow in the sun and descant on mine own deformity. And therefore, since I cannot prove a lover, this is really the crucial part, I think, to entertain these farewell spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days. Plots have I laid, inductions dangerous, by drunken prophecies, libels, and dreams, to set my brother Clarence and the king in deadly hate, the one against the other. And there's a few lines more, maybe 7 lines more, that just sort of sets up the opening bit. But this idea of, and therefore, since I cannot prove a lover, to entertain these farewell spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain. There is, I mean, this is one of the things that, like, disability studies people working on Shakespeare are very, very quick to point out when disability studies emerged as a discipline in the humanities in the 90s and early 2000s. There is a very clear link that Richard is making and that other characters reinforce between his physical body and his character. That he is evil because he is deformed. So I think that's a really important thing for us to talk about. So I'll let you sort of go where you'd like to go with that idea.
Yeah, this is definitely a problematic idea. And the goal of disability studies is to show how literature has helped develop these problematic discourses that we try to overcome today. Like we try to overcome those old stereotypes and prejudices. There's in the Renaissance there was this idea that if you have a deformity of some sort, like a humpback or something like that, it was a sign of evil, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if I have too much more to say on that other than that, except for the play is fascinating to read from that perspective, and especially if you want to feel pity for Richard, if you want to to kind of go on the ride and sympathize with them. I think his disability plays a large part in that, because
Yeah.
if the word nature in that soliloquy was important, cheated a fair proportion by nature. It's his nature to be this way. His body shows evidence of that. So he might as well be a villain.
So I think that's interesting. Like, in order to see this as a point of sympathy for Richard, do you think we have to sort of ignore? I
think modern audiences probably do feel a little more sympathy, because we do think of this
Okay.
in different ways. Richard's audience, at the time that Shakespeare was writing the play, I don't think they would have felt sympathy for him, because they did see disability in this way.
Okay. Yeah. Good. That's exactly the kind of thing I was struggling to sort of figure out the question for. So the other point I do want to make about disability, and this is very sort of at this particular moment, because for my students in the literary London class I'm about to lead, this is going to be very relevant, but for people just watching this generally on YouTube, maybe less so. Apparently, so we're going to see Richard III at the Globe in London, and apparently there is a big debate about it going on right now, because the performer playing Richard is not disabled. And so it's interesting, because she's a female actor, and there doesn't seem to be debate about that, which is probably a function of British theater especially has had race-blind and gender-blind casting for a long time, especially with things like Shakespeare or Greek drama. But there is this sort of debate about, should a non-disabled actor be cast to play a character with disabilities like Richard, or should this be a space in which actors with disabilities get acting work? And then the sort of flip side of that ultimately becomes, should actors with, if we say actors with only, sorry, if we say only parts for characters with disabilities should be played by actors with disabilities. Or, sorry, if we say characters with disabilities should only be played by actors with disabilities, does that then sort of undercut the idea of casting actors with disabilities or playing characters without disabilities? I've seen arguments each way in the little bit of familiarity I have with disability studies. That's really not my area of primary focus. But I've seen arguments both ways, that if we insist on aligning the character's physical or developmental abilities with the actor's physical or developmental abilities, then there's more of an argument for saying, like, well, Clarence or Buckingham or Margaret or whoever doesn't have a disability, so we should only be casting actors without disabilities for those roles. So is it beneficial to actors with disabilities who want to work and might not want to just be playing parts like Richard or the girl from Glass Menagerie, whose name I can't remember? If we're doing things like race-blind casting, gender-blind casting, should we also be trying to do things like disability-blind casting? Or does the negative result of casting a traditionally able actor in a character like Richard outweigh that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't really thought of this question too much before. Um, of course, when it has come to race in Shakespeare, we've grown more sensitive to that. Like back in the 50s, Laurence
Yeah,
Olivier played Othello and wore blackface, right? And today, that version of the play is seen as very offensive, rightfully
yeah,
so. Um, yeah, as far as my gut is telling me that you don't really need a disabled actor to play Richard. Like I think I kind of fall into the camp that if you limit Richard to just a disabled actor, you're sort of typecasting disabled actors. I think
yeah,
that's my gut feeling on it. I would need to read more about it, but yeah, I mean, throughout the play, Richard is usually depicted like he usually has a humpback. He usually has a funny walk. Uh,
yeah.
yeah, so I'm sensitive to the folks who are sensitive about this question, who say that you should have a disabled actor. At the same time, I can see the other argument that it would be typecasting to
Yeah.
disabled actors play disabled parts. So I think I'm more in the camp of it doesn't matter if the actor is or not. What do you
Okay.
think? What do you think about that, Phil?
I really don't. I really don't know. I mean, I think there's extremely good arguments for each side, and I'm not convinced that there's a right answer necessarily. Um, I'm trying to just sort of flip through this and see if there's a good image, because I know there were historical performances, especially in like the 19th century, early 20th century, with just these very, very predominant prosthetic pumps on Richard's back. Um, of course, the other thing from an actor's perspective is where this production is taking place, right? Because um, I'm sure for your company, Appalachian Shakespeare uh, Company, the community theater that I work with, Sock and Buskin, like who we can cast is whoever shows up for audition.
Right.
But someplace like Shakespeare's Globe in London or the National Theatre, Broadway theaters, the Royal Shakespeare Company, places like this, like they can call up an actor and say, "Hey, we're doing Richard III. We really would like you to play Richard." So I think that's another element that may be sort of worth mentioning is there are discrepancies in the talent pools that a performance company like uh, the Globe or whatever it is can draw from versus what smaller, more localized theaters can draw from. And so that may that may tip the scales in some ways as well. Like I know if Sock and Buskin was going to do Richard III, based on the two casting sessions that I've done with Sock and Buskin, like we didn't have actors with humped backs, bent backs, shriveled arms showing up. Like we couldn't specifically cast that necessarily. Like we would have to work with whoever is there. But again, if you have the option to reach out to actors with disabilities to play parts with disabilities,
Why not? Right?
yeah,
A
I
lot
don't
of
know. I don't. I don't think, again, like I said, I don't think there's a good answer to it. I think there's compelling arguments to be made either way. But I think the discussion is worth having.
Yeah, like the director's vision, I think, is probably important to this too. Like
Yeah.
if the director really wants to emphasize the disability aspects of the play, then I could see where it would be fitting to cast a disabled actor.
Yeah.
So the play also has a lot of physical elements too. Like we had this very we practiced the choreography in Act 5
Yeah.
just about as much as we practiced the play. There's a lot of physical elements to the performance. If you do a battle scene,
Yeah.
that I could maybe a disabled actor would have a harder time pulling off. Maybe not, depending on the disability.
Yeah.
But so there's all those elements to take into consideration too.
Yeah.
For a company like ours, especially Richard, that's something I wanted to mention in this. Richard has so many parts that pretty much all of our actors had to take on 2 or 3 parts, except for Richard. Like I played Clarence, and I played then after I died, I played Ratcliffe.
Mm.
So yeah, again, for a smaller company, it depends on how many actors you have and who shows up. But for the bigger companies, they can choose to be more selective.
Yeah. I think that's probably the way it was at the time when Shakespeare would have been putting this on, is they didn't have a ton of actors. And so you almost certainly would have had double casting, triple casting, people playing maybe up to 5 parts, something like that. But yeah, for modern companies with tons of resources, you could have one actor playing each role, and you can just have 25 actors or whatever it is. But yeah, yeah, definitely. That's another sort of element that, as a director, you need to think about in terms of artistic vision, but also in terms of the resources and constraints of the production.
Yeah, we had 10 or 15 actors, and 10 to, I don't remember how many, but it was in that ballpark, and all of us had the 2 or 3 parts, except for Richard. So this is very much a play that's difficult to perform for that very reason alone.
Yeah. That's history plays in Shakespeare. They've got so many characters. Yeah.
It's a little confusing. It's a little confusing to an audience too, just because if they're not familiar with the historical context, and starting with Richard can be daunting.
Yeah. All right. I want to wrap up there. This has been a great conversation. It's been a relatively long conversation, but very rewarding. We covered a lot of great ground. So, Jeff, thank you so much for talking with me about this play and bringing your sort of experience from performing it. So yeah,
It was good. Thanks, Phil.